Okay, hello everyone, and welcome back after a long hiatus, you could say. I've been doing different things, and I want to come back to this because I do love this little rules series on Magic the Gathering, and we've been going over the who, what, where, when, and how of the game as kind of the structure of our organization. So today we're going to talk about the how, and I figure kind of the theme of that would be the topic of mana cost. And the mana cost is the cost associated with using spells and abilities of cards. And they could be colored, so which you need to use one of the 5 colors to activate that ability or cast that spell. That's pretty simple. Or it could be colorless, and a colorless mana cost could be paid with any type of mana. And you would think that it ends right there, and that's all you need to know, but it is a bit more complicated, so let's just jump right in. And the first topic I want to touch on is kind of just analyzing what makes a good cost to a spell. So in other words, what is efficient and what has a good payout. And an easy way to think of that is there an efficient payout for what you're trying to do? So in other words, there should be at least a 1-to-1 ratio. For every 1 mana spent, you're getting 1 effect that is something you want. So if you're trying to cast a creature, and let's say it costs 2 mana, you should at least get a 2/2 creature. And if you're just getting a 2/2 creature, well, that's the bare minimum of what you would kind of deserve for spending 2 mana. But there are a lot of other 2-cost creatures that also have abilities and have a lot of triggers, and there are some that are even 3/3s or 4/4s for 2 cost. So try to look for that because you want to be efficient. So kind of another category you could think of is for draw spells, having a 1-to-1 where you spend 1 mana and you get 1 card for drawing. And that's actually the case with Opt, where you only draw 1 card, but you can also do it at instant speed, and you can scry first. So that is what I would call a profit, and a pretty good card in a lot of decks. Kind of at the end of the day, though, it's still 1 card. But something like Treasure Cruise is insanely good, because it's actually potentially a 1 cost for drawing 3 cards. Which, if you know, is pretty similar to Ancestral Recall. And those are actually too good of a profit, so those are actually banned or restricted in most formats. And so if something is too good, they do have kind of a drawback. So that's something to think about. Is the drawback better than, is it worth it to include in the deck for what you're trying to do? Something that's an example of a bad card, I would say, for this is Armistice, because you pay 5 mana to draw 1 card and give your opponent life, and I don't think that really pays out for what you're trying to do. And the same kind of idea applies for life gain, I would think, where you pay 1 mana and you should get 1 life at least, which, you should get much more than that, because this is an example here, Light of Hope is a great card for life gain decks. You spend 1 mana at instant speed to gain 4 life, and then you have some other options if you need, which is just card to card better than Sacred Nectar. And then, of course, there are some examples of bad life gain cards, in my opinion, like this Orzhov, the Church of Deals, because I would probably never pay 5 mana to only gain 1 life out of that. So I would call that the Church of the Ripoff, because it's a ripoff to pay 5 mana for 1 life, when there are other better options for the same effect. So kind of keep that same idea in mind for wheels, extra turns, destroy spells, ramps, and things of that nature. You want to have an efficiency in what you're trying to do, so try to always compare different cards to others that do the same effect and see what's better. And kind of that does also depend on your play group, your budget, and then the theme of your deck. So you might not mind giving your opponent life or sacrificing your own creatures as a drawback, depending on your strategy. So keep that in mind. And we could go on and on about what makes a spell good, and that is somewhat subjective, like I said. But let's move on and talk about different types of mana costs, because there's quite a few. And it's important to know the difference to help develop themes and what you want to do. And the first one here is hybrid cost. Hybrid cost spells and abilities have this little split cost in the symbol, and that means you can use either or to pay for the spell. You could use either color. Like, for example, this Azorius Guildmage, it costs either blue or white, so that helps the game give you flexibility. You don't need all the mana base to do it. And there are some that are also monocolored hybrid, which means they could cost the colored mana, or they could cost 2 of the colorless mana to cast. So like the Reaper King here, he could cost 10 colorless mana, or he could cost 5 colored mana, one of each, or maybe some combination thereof, and that helps him be easier to cast. And then there are alternate cost spells, which you could kind of think of these as free spells, because it says instead of paying the mana cost, you could do a certain action. So you could actually be entirely tapped out with all of your mana emptied, and you could still cast this. Like Force of Will or Force of Negation allows you to counter a spell by exiling a blue card from your hand. And there are some lesser known free spells like Foil and Misdirection, and those are good because you can catch your opponents by surprise. So that's typically a blue thing. And then kind of the opposite are additional cost spells. Additional cost you must pay in addition to the mana, while alternative you may pay the alternative of the cost. So you could kind of think of it kind of like a trade-off, because maybe it costs less, but it has another thing you must do. So like Abjure, you have to sacrifice a blue permanent to counter a spell, but for only 1 cost, while typically counterspell is a 2-cost spell, or even a 3-cost for other ones. So that's good. Let's say in a Merfolk deck you have plenty of Merfolks to spare, or you don't mind just sacrificing something you're not using at the time. And in black, it typically involves sacrifices, like Demon of Catastrophes here is a 6/6 flying and trample for only 4 costs, but you have to sacrifice a creature. But that's I would say it's a pretty fair trade-off, because you're replacing, let's say, a 2/2 zombie with a 6/6 flyer and trample. So that's something to keep in mind. And then one of my favorite cards for this is Crop Rotation, and I have that in my MRF land deck that I previously posted on. You are getting rid of a land for 1 mana at instant speed to replace it with any other land, because it says search your library for a land. So that is really good, because you can trade out a forest for a temple garden, or maybe a utility land to help you out at instant speed. So if you're using a land deck, I'd say this is a must-have card. And then there are X value cost spells, and the X value is determined by the player as you cast it. So actually keep in mind if you are... so sometimes if you are like searching for a card, the X is considered 0 if you're not casting it. So keep that in mind. But when you do cast it, and you can pour in any amount of mana that you want into it to get a greater effect out of it. So this is kind of dependent on the player. So for example here, Mass Manipulation, it costs XX and 4 blue. So to get control of 1 creature, you need to pay 6 mana. which is okay compared to other steel spells. But the cool thing about this one is you can get control of a planeswalker, so that's a little unique. But if you had infinite mana, you could, I guess, gain control of everything, so that's pretty cool. And in the right deck, I would say Biomass Mutation. That's a pretty cool card. I could turn, all of my Thopters into 5/5 creatures for 7 mana. And if you have a lot of tokens to replace, that could be pretty good. And if you wanted to make an X value themed deck, you might want to consider Hydras. Hydra creatures, they always have an X somewhere in the card. So overall, X cost depends on the player and the board state. And then there are Snow Mana. Snow Mana is used to cast Snow Permanents. And Snow Mana is represented by this little snowflake symbol here. So not much else to say, except that it's limited to snow decks, kind of, unless you have another way to make Snow Mana. Some examples here: you have Snow Peak Yeti, Icehide Golem, and Cover of Winter. And then there is finally Phyrexian Mana. And Phyrexian Mana is this little symbol here with the circle and the line through it. And it can be paid with either the colored symbol of it, or it can pay 2 life. So you could think of this like a free spell, because Noxious Revival only cost a Phyrexian symbol, but you can just pay the life instead. And so that's cool. It's another way to catch your opponents by surprise. And 2 life, not a big deal in the end in most decks, especially in a commander game where you start with 40. It's a pretty good trade-off to get around the mana base instead. And then there are some cards that actually combine, different parts of what we talked about. Like this newer card, Ajani Sleeper Agent. He has a hybrid and Phyrexian mana in his cost, so that gives you even more flexibility to cast him. Same thing with Tamio Completed Sage. And I guess potentially one day Wizards might have a Snow Mana hybrid X costs, so all of these could come into play in different cards. So just keep in mind all these different things and how you can use them to your advantage in your deck and your strategy. So that's all there is to say, I think, about mana cost. That is how you cast spells, and how you cast spells and how you do it depends on you, and really just the more mana you have, the better, so you don't have to worry about a lot of this stuff. And if you have any questions or concerns, feel free to leave a comment and let me know. But I'll get back to you as soon as I possible, and I'll see you in the next video. Thank you.